Kasserine Pass, western Tunisia. February 20th, 1943. The wind carried the smell of burning oil and diesel across 60 miles of desert. American M3 Lee tanks lay broken in the sand, their high 7-foot silhouettes torn open by German 88mm shells fired from ranges the crews never lived to measure. 6,500 American boys were dead, wounded, or captured in 6 days of fighting. Nearly 200 tanks destroyed, an entire armored division functionally wrecked. And in a German staff tent 40 miles east, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, the man who had driven the British Empire across 2,000 miles of North African sand, looked at the reports and told his officers what he had already written in his own private papers. The Americans, he said, were not yet soldiers. They had equipment, they had numbers, they had courage. They lacked the one thing no factory could manufacture. They lacked command. This is the story of what happened next. When the most feared armored commander in the German military believed he could destroy what remained of the American army in Africa, and the man Dwight Eisenhower sent to prove him wrong was a 57-year-old cavalry general who had been waiting for this fight his entire life. His name was George Smith Patton, Jr. February 25th, 1943, Tebessa, Algeria. The United States Second Corps had ceased to function as a fighting organization. That was not editorial judgment. That was the conclusion written into the after-action reports of American officers who had watched the collapse unfold and had no better word for it. The numbers were already public. What the numbers did not capture, what the reports from the front could not put into words, was what came after them. When Rommel's panzers finally halted, stopped not by American resistance, but by overextended supply lines and a British defensive line to the north, the men of Second Corps were not regrouping. They were drifting, moving in small packs through the Algerian mountains, uncertain of their own unit boundaries, uncertain of their officers, uncertain of whether anyone was coming to retrieve them, or whether the whole theater had simply collapsed while they weren't looking. An army that believes it has been beaten sometimes becomes an army that cannot stop believing it. That was what Dwight Eisenhower feared. And in the last week of February 1943, Eisenhower did something that generals rarely do in the middle of an active campaign. He asked hard questions about his own officers. He sent Major General Ernest Harmon, a tough, plain-spoken cavalry officer, forward to investigate. Not the enemy, his own command. Harmon spent 3 days moving through Second Corps rear areas. He came back to Algiers with a report that stripped the paint off Eisenhower's office walls. The commander of Second Corps, Major General Lloyd Fredendall, 59 years old, was not commanding. He was hiding. Fredendall had ordered a command bunker constructed near Tebessa, more than 60 miles beyond lines. Engineers had spent weeks tunneling into a mountainside to build it. Underground, galleries, blast-proof doors, communications rooms carved from solid rock. Fredendall had never once, in weeks of fighting, driven forward to see his troops. Not a single division commander had received a personal visit. He communicated in a bizarre private code that referred to units as the walking boys and geographical features as the flat one and the tall one, so that even his own staff could not always determine what he was ordering. Harmon told Eisenhower plainly, the problem was not the German army. The problem was the American command. If Second Corps was going to hold Tunisia, someone had to relieve Fredendall immediately, and Harmon had a name in mind. He recommended a General Eisenhower already knew well, a man currently sitting in Morocco planning invasion of Sicily, waiting for a war he was afraid he might miss. His name was Patton. Now consider the man Rommel had been given as an enemy at Kasserine. Consider what Rommel was in February of 1943. 51 years old, broken by illness. His blood pressure was dangerously high. His stomach could not hold food for more than an hour without pain. His face in the intelligence photographs Allied officers studied showed a man who had aged 10 years in 24 months. But he was still the Desert Fox, still the commander who had taken a mixed German-Italian force across 2,000 miles of North African desert, still the officer whose name alone had, in the darkest months of 1,941 and 1,942, been enough to freeze British staff officers in mid-sentence at its mention. He had studied the Americans through the smoke of Kasserine, and in his private papers, later edited by the British military historian Basil Henry Littlehart and published as the Rommel Papers, he had written the assessment that shaped everything the German command in Tunisia believed for the next month. The Americans, Rommel wrote, had shown themselves not yet ready. They had equipment, courage, and numbers. They lacked command. 2,300 miles away, in a French colonial villa in Casablanca, Morocco, that assessment was being read by the man who was about to make Rommel eat every word of it. George Smith Patton, Jr. was 57 years old. He had spent his career preparing for exactly this moment and had begun to fear the moment might never arrive. He had commanded the Western Task Force in the torch landings in November, taken Casablanca from Vichy French forces in 3 days, and then been ordered to sit in Morocco planning the invasion of Sicily while the real fighting happened elsewhere. Every morning he read the situation reports from Tunisia. Every morning he wrote in his diary that he was going insane. He wore 2 ivory-handled revolvers, not pearl. He was particular about that. Pearl-handled revolvers, he said, were for New Orleans piano players. He wore a lacquered helmet liner polished to reflect sunlight in ways that infantry commanders considered tactically insane. He spoke in a high, almost squeaky voice that surprised men meeting him for the first time. And he read history. He read constantly. He believed, more literally than most modern Americans would find comfortable, that he had lived before as a Roman legionary, as a soldier of Alexander, as a captain of Napoleon. He was preparing for a war he felt he had been born several times to fight. On March 6th, 1943, the telephone call he had been waiting for since November finally came. Eisenhower's headquarters in Algiers. Fredendall was out. Patton was to fly to 2nd Corps headquarters immediately. His orders were 3 words long. Restore the situation. He arrived at Jebel Kouif the next morning. What happened when he stepped out of the vehicle would be talked about by every man who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. But at almost the same hour, 300 miles east, the story about to unfold was already changing in a way that Patton did not yet know and would not fully understand for decades. In a rear area medical facility outside Sfax, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was signing paperwork he did not want to sign. His personal physician had ordered him back to Germany for treatment. Hitler had approved the order 2 days earlier. Rommel was leaving Africa, not returning, leaving. On March 9th, 1943, 3 days after Patton took command of 2nd Corps, Rommel boarded a transport aircraft and flew out of Tunisia for the last time. The Desert Fox, the enemy Patton had spent his life imagining he would one day fight, was gone before the fight ever began. The duel that history would forever remember, the confrontation between the 2 most theatrical armored commanders of the Second World War, would never actually happen. Not on any battlefield. Not in any command post. They would never see each other, never fire on each other's forces directly, never share a moment of the same map with the same objective between them. Command of the Axis forces in Tunisia passed to Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. 53 years old, a Prussian aristocrat and career armor officer who was, by any professional measure, a highly capable commander. Von Arnim had none of Rommel's flair for publicity. He was not a favorite of Hitler's inner circle. He wrote orders that were precise, dry, and effective. And he inherited from Rommel one thing that would shape the next 30 days more than any tactical calculation. He inherited Rommel's contempt for the American soldier. Rommel was gone. His shadow remained. His staff officers, his division commanders, his intelligence officers had been trained for months to see the American army the way their commander had seen it. That belief had become doctrine. Doctrine had become planning. And planning was about to meet the man Eisenhower had just handed Second Corps to. March 7th, 1943, 10 o'clock in the morning, Jebel Kouif, western Tunisia. The Second Corps headquarters was a sprawl of tents and half-tracks and requisitioned French farm buildings, arranged with the ragged geometry of an American army that had spent 3 months learning that war did not care how tidy your camp looked. Officers moved with their shoulders rounded. Enlisted men avoided eye contact. Nobody saluted with particular energy. The men who worked there had been living for weeks in the shadow of what had happened at Kasserine. Then the siren started. Patton's cavalcade rolled into headquarters at high speed. Motorcycles first, then the scout cars. Then the command vehicle, flags cracking in the wind, klaxons deliberately loud, engine noise deliberately excessive. Men came out of tents to see what disaster had arrived. What arrived was not a disaster. What arrived was a 57-year-old cavalry general in a lacquered helmet, twin revolvers on his hips, standing in the open turret of his half-track and looking at his new command with the expression of a man who had just been handed a broken watch and told to fix it in 90 minutes. 90 minutes. That was how long it took. Within an hour and a half of dismounting, Patton had relieved 2 staff officers, called every division commander to headquarters for a briefing, and issued a general order that would be remembered by every man who served under him in Tunisia for the rest of their lives. Every soldier of every rank in every unit of Second Corps would wear his helmet at all times. In camp, on patrol, in the mess tent, in the desert heat that reached 110 degrees by noon, every soldier would wear his necktie. Every officer would wear his leggings. The penalty for violation was $25 per offense for enlisted men and $50 for officers. $25 in 1,943 was more than a private's monthly pay. The order applied to medical officers performing surgery. It applied to cooks in field kitchens. It applied to mechanics under tank engines. There were no exceptions. There would be no exceptions. And Patton personally, during the 17 days that followed, would drive from unit to unit, appearing without warning, looking for infractions. The men hated it. That was the point. Patton believed, with the certainty of a man who had studied warfare since he was old enough to read Latin, that an army that had lost its self-respect could not recover by being spoken to kindly. He believed that discipline in the small things, the pointless seeming things, the things a man could not rationalize away, was the only foundation on which discipline in the large things could be rebuilt. Neckties in the desert were not about neckties. They were about a soldier, every morning, having to make a small, deliberate act of professional pride. 100 small acts became habit. Habit became identity. Identity became the thing that decided whether a man ran or held when the first shell landed. Veterans of Second Corps, interviewed decades later, would remember the necktie order with a specific tone of voice. They hated it at the time. They understood it later. Some of them said, in their own words, that it had saved their lives. But Patton was not done firing officers. And this is where the story most Americans have heard about Patton in Tunisia becomes incomplete. Fredendall was the famous relief. Fredendall was the one who made the newspapers. What did not make the newspapers? Because it did not fit the shape of the story Second Corps wanted to tell after the campaign, was that Patton kept firing officers all through March. Battalion commanders who had frozen at Kasserine, regimental staff officers who could not explain what their units had done during the retreat. And at the top of the list, in a confrontation that Omar Bradley would later record in his memoirs with the exact phrasing intact, Major General Orlando Ward, the commander of the 1st Armored Division. Ward was not a coward. Ward was, by every reasonable evaluation, a competent officer who had been placed in an impossible situation with inadequate reconnaissance and poor higher command intelligence. His division had been torn apart at Kasserine largely because of Fredendall's orders, not his own decisions. Patton knew this. It did not matter. On March 22nd, during a telephone conversation about ongoing operations near Macnassie, Ward mentioned to Patton, in the tone of a man delivering good news, that his division had suffered light casualties that day and no officers had been killed. Patton exploded. "God damn it, Ward," he shouted into the receiver in words that Bradley recorded verbatim in A Soldier's Story, published in 1951. "That's not fortunate. That's bad for the morale of the enlisted men. I want you to get more officers killed." Ward, stunned, asked if he had heard correctly. "Yes, goddammit. I'm serious," Patton said. Bradley described what happened next in his own words. He said nothing. He watched, because he understood, and Ward did not, what Patton was really saying. Patton was not asking Ward to send officers to their deaths. Patton was telling Ward that in an American army that had just been humiliated in front of the world, the officers had to be visible at the point of contact. They had to bleed where the enlisted men could see them bleeding. The men had to see that the officers were not going to hide behind them the way Fredendall had hidden behind everyone. An officer who did exactly that, who understood it in his bones without being told, was already walking the front lines of the 1st Infantry Division with a wooden cane. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., 55 years old, son of the president, was the assistant division commander of the Big Red One under Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen. He had a heart condition his own doctors were still tracking. He walked with a cane because of arthritis from wounds he had taken as an infantry officer in the First World War. He wore a soft wool knit cap in preference to a helmet whenever he could get away with it. He was, in the most literal military sense, at the outer edge of what was considered medically acceptable for combat command in a desert campaign. He walked the forward positions of every regiment in the division, every day, on foot, with his cane. He knew the names of company commanders, platoon sergeants, and hundreds of enlisted men. He carried a Colt .45 automatic on his hip and his father's walking cane in his hand, and he refused, on principle, to be driven when his men were walking. His men, in the letters they wrote home from Tunisia, called him simply Teddy, not General, not Roosevelt, Teddy, because he had made himself that kind of officer on purpose. 40 miles south, in the Ranger Battalion assembly area outside Gafsa, another officer was making a smaller but equally telling decision. Colonel William Orlando Darby, 32 years old, commander of the 1st Ranger Battalion, had received a promotion offer from higher headquarters. Full colonel to brigadier general, a staff position, away from the front, away from the risks, a career-making assignment for a man his age. Darby refused it, in writing. He asked to be allowed to remain with the Rangers he had trained personally, whose names he knew, whose parents he had corresponded with. His superiors, understanding what they were reading, approved the refusal. By March 15th, 2nd Corps was not the shattered organization Patton had inherited. It was tired, it was angry, and it was profoundly annoyed at its new commander. But it was, for the first time since Kasserine, an army. And the plan Patton had brought with him was about to be executed. March 17th, 1943, St. Patrick's Day. The 1st Infantry Division moved on Gafsa, a caravan town at the edge of the Tunisian interior, expecting a hard fight. What they found was empty streets and abandoned Italian equipment. Italian defenders had withdrawn hours before. Gafsa fell without a shot. The Americans set it up as a forward supply base and looked east toward a smaller town 20 miles down the road, a place called El Guettar, March 18th, 1943. 400 hours. Colonel William Darby and the 1st Ranger Battalion moved out of Gafsa in darkness, boots wrapped in rags, no flashlights, no talking above a whisper. Their objective was El Guettar, an oasis town 20 miles east, sitting astride the highway that ran between Gafsa and the coastal city of Gabes. If the Americans could push east from El Guettar to the coast, the entire German force in southern Tunisia would be cut off from its supply lines. The Wehrmacht could not allow that to happen. The Rangers expected to fight for the town. They did not fight for the town. When Darby's lead scouts entered El Guettar at first light, the Italian garrison, drawn from the Centauro Armored Division, was already gone. The Italians had not surrendered. They had done something more dangerous. They had withdrawn to the high ground east of the town, to a series of rocky ridges and mountain passes overlooking the Gafsa-Gabes highway, and they had dug in. From those ridges, the Italians could see every vehicle moving on the road below. They could see American supply columns arriving at Gafsa. They could see the Ranger Battalion moving through El Guettar. And they were reporting all of it by radio to German headquarters at Sfax and Maknassi. As long as the Italians held the high ground, no American force could safely move east. Darby studied the ridges through binoculars for 2 days. On the night of March 20th, 1943, in an operation that would become one of the founding legends of the American Ranger tradition, he moved his battalion up a section of cliff that the Italian defenders had considered unclimbable. There was no path. There were no fixed ropes. There was only a fissure in the limestone that Darby's scouts had found the previous afternoon, running from the desert floor to a point roughly 30 feet below the summit where the Italian position began. The Rangers went up hand over hand in the dark. Ammunition was passed up in leather bags on a system of ropes rigged as they climbed. Radios were carried in canvas cases strapped across men's backs. Every man knew that a single stone dislodged, a single voice raised, a single flashlight accidentally uncovered would end the operation in a slaughter from above. Not one man dislodged a stone, not one man raised his voice. At approximately 0400, Darby's Rangers hit the Italian position from behind and above. From the one direction, the Italians had assured themselves no attack could come. 200 Italian soldiers surrendered before dawn. The high ground north of El Guettar belonged to the Americans. Over the next 48 hours, the rest of the 1st Infantry Division moved forward under Major General Terry Allen. On March 21st, they took Jebel El Ankh, the ridge line north of the highway. On March 22nd, they took Jebel Berda, the taller ridge to the south. By nightfall on the 22nd, Allen's men occupied a horseshoe of hills wrapped around the eastern approach to El Guettar. German attack came, it would have to come up the highway itself through the narrow valley between those two ridges into the muzzles of Allen's artillery and the guns of his infantry above. And this is where Patton, for all his fury and all his study, made a mistake that could have cost him the entire campaign. He was looking the wrong direction. 60 miles to the north, at a smaller road junction called Maknassi, Major General Orlando Ward, the same Ward that Patton had berated on the telephone, was pushing the 1st Armored Division east against determined German resistance. Patton believed, based on the German reinforcement patterns his intelligence officers were tracking, that von Arnim would counterattack Ward's armor. That belief was not stupid. It was, in fact, the more probable German response. Armor duels armor. Maknassi was where the German 10th Panzer Division could be brought to bear most effectively against an American armored target. On the night of March 22nd, 1943, Patton went to bed fully clothed at his forward command post. Boots on, uniform buttoned, revolvers within reach on the field cot. He was expecting to be woken before dawn by news of a German counterattack against Ward. The counterattack came. It did not come at Maknassi. It came at El Guettar. At the same hour, Patton was closing his eyes, fully dressed 60 miles away, In the command post of the 10th Panzer Division, 40 miles east of El Guettar, Major General Friedrich Freiherr von Broich was writing the operational order that would put 50 tanks on the road before dawn. Von Broich was 46 years old, a Prussian nobleman, a veteran of the French campaign of 1940, and the winter fighting outside Moscow in 1941. A professional soldier of exactly the kind the German army had spent a century producing. He had inherited from Rommel and from von Arnim the settled belief that the Americans were still what Kasserine had shown them to be. His operational assumptions reflected that belief in ways he would spend the rest of his life reconsidering. His attack would come at 0600, 50 Panzer II's and IVs in a diamond formation, supported by Marder, self-propelled anti-tank guns, and Panzer Grenadier Infantry in half-tracks and motorcycle sidecars. His objective was to break through the American line east of El Guettar, roll over the American artillery on the ridges, and drive west into the American rear. He expected the Americans to break as they had broken at Kasserine. He was unaware of two things. The first was that at approximately 1800 hours on March 22nd, Terry Allen had received a specific instruction from Patton to bolster his anti-tank defenses along the Gafsa highway. Allen had responded by ordering Lieutenant Colonel Herschel Doc Baker's 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion forward to occupy positions along a low ridge called El Kedab, immediately south of the highway. Baker moved his men into position after dark on the 22nd. Baker had 31 M3 gun motor carriages serviceable, mounting 75mm cannons on half-track chassis. He placed them on the forward slope of El Kedab in defilade positions that commanded the highway and the wadis on both sides of it. He liked the ground. He wrote later that the terrain on the German axis of approach consisted of dry streambeds and rolling ridges with knolls that would break up an armored formation moving at speed. He was correct. He did not yet know how correct. The second thing von Broich did not know was that on the same night, American engineers of the 1st Infantry Division had spent the darkness laying an anti-tank minefield across the axis of any likely German approach. The mines were emplaced hastily, without the survey precision that peacetime doctrine required, but in exactly the pattern of narrow, rocky terrain that Baker had studied and that von Broich's reconnaissance had not seen. The minefield was on no German map. It was on no captured overlay. It existed as of the night of March 22nd, and it existed nowhere else. Approximately 0445 on March 23rd, 1943, roughly 75 minutes before the German attack was scheduled to begin, an event occurred that in the entire war would rarely be replicated. A German motorcycle sidecar, carrying 2 soldiers of a forward reconnaissance element of the 10th Panzer Division, took a wrong turn in the pre-dawn darkness and drove directly into the American lines. One soldier was captured immediately. The other was wounded and taken prisoner minutes later. Captured soldier, faced with an American officer and an interpreter, gave up what he knew within minutes. There would be a major armored attack at 0600, tanks in the lead, infantry following. The direction of attack was up the Gafsa highway straight into the position where Baker's 601st was already sitting. The information reached Baker within 20 minutes. He had roughly 45 minutes to prepare his crews for the fight of their lives. He used every one of them. 0600 hours, March 23rd, 1943, the El Guettar Valley. The sun was still below the horizon. Sky over the Jebel Berda Ridge was gray-pink, the sand cold, the air holding a stillness that any soldier who has been under armor attack will tell you is a stillness that stops meaning anything the moment you hear the first engines. Engines came from the east. 50 Panzer II's and IVs of the German 10th Panzer Division rolled into the eastern mouth of the El Guettar Valley in a wedge formation. Behind them came the half-tracks, carrying Panzer Grenadier Infantry in the tropical khaki tunics of the Afrika Korps, sleeves rolled, weapons across their knees. Behind the half-tracks came the motorcycle sidecars, weaving through the formation with the specific practiced quickness of veteran forward observers. The whole force moved as one organism. A German Panzer Division, at full operational strength, had spent the previous 2 years perfecting exactly this kind of dawn armored assault against Soviet infantry that had broken again and again at the sight of it. At his headquarters on the reverse slope of Jebel Burda, Major General Terry Allen was already out of his cot and moving before his aide could reach him. Reports were coming in by field telephone from the forward battalions. The 1st Battalion of the 18th Infantry Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel Robert H. Taking, direct armored assault. York's forward companies were being overrun. 2 companies had lost contact with battalion headquarters within the first 10 minutes. Panzers broke. The Panzers broke through. They broke through the wadi crossings that the American forward positions had considered defensible. They broke through the outposts on the valley floor. Within 30 minutes of the attack beginning, a spearhead of the 10th Panzer had pushed 6 miles into the American position, deep enough that 2 Panzer IVs came within sight of Allen's own command post. An aide told Allen, in the measured tone of a professional soldier delivering unwelcome news, that he might want to consider moving his headquarters to the rear. Allen looked at the man. His answer became one of the most quoted lines in the history of the American infantry. "I will like hell pull out," Allen said, "and I'll shoot the first bastard who does." The command post did not move, and then the Panzers hit the minefield, not the main formation. The main formation was still forming up in the valley floor, and the lead elements were still moving fast. But the flanking element, a company-strength push designed to envelop the American right, drove into the belt of anti-tank mines the American engineers had laid in the darkness the night before. The lead panzer went up in a cloud of black smoke and shredded track links. The 2 panzers behind it stopped. The half-tracks, carrying panzer grenadiers behind those, stopped. The whole southern arm of the assault, dozens of vehicles, moving at coordinated speed, dissolved in 90 seconds into a stalled column with no room to maneuver. Von Broich, 40 miles east, at the 10th Panzer Command Post, listened to the reports that's coming in over his radio net and did not immediately understand what he was hearing. His forward officers were reporting a minefield in a location where no minefield should have existed. His intelligence overlays, updated as recently as March 20th, showed the American engineers had not been active in that sector. The minefield was a surprise not because the Americans had hidden it, but because they had built it in a single night without the survey chains and marked lanes that peacetime doctrine required, in exactly the terrain that a German commander trained on Soviet front operations would consider an obvious armored corridor. Pause was fatal. On El Khadab, Lieutenant Colonel Baker's 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion had spent 45 minutes moving into firing position. His M3 gun motor carriages, 75mm guns mounted on half-track chassis, were emplaced in defilade behind the crest of the ridge, with only their gun tubes visible against the horizon. The gunners had been briefed. The observers had ranged the valley floor. When the German southern column stalled in the minefield, Baker's gunners had targets that were stationary, in the open and at optimum range for the 75s. They opened fire. The artillery of the 1st Infantry Division, 32 guns of the 32nd Field Artillery Battalion, and additional battalions in support opened at nearly the same moment. Concentrated fire on the valley floor. Air bursts over the stalled German infantry. High explosive rounds walking across the panzer formation in patterns that were not tactical genius, but were, at that range and against those targets, simply arithmetic. Panzers began to burn. Over the next several hours, the 10th Panzer Division made repeated attempts to press the attack through the American position. Each attempt failed against the same combination. Baker's tank destroyers on the flanks, the minefield fragmenting the formations, and the massed artillery of the Big Red One breaking every rush before it could develop. By late morning, the Germans launched a second major thrust. It failed the same way. By afternoon, von Broich issued the order that no commander in the 10th Panzer Division had expected to give against American troops. He ordered a general withdrawal. By the end of the day, the 10th Panzer had lost between 30 and 37 tanks, according to the accounting from both sides. Baker's 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion had lost 14 men killed and 21 of its 31 M3 half-tracks destroyed. The battalion would receive the Presidential Unit Citation for the action, the first tank destroyer unit in United States history to receive that recognition. Guettar was the first ground victory of the American Army over German armor in the Second World War. Patton received the news at his forward command post at 0700 hours, when the situation was still confused and the outcome still uncertain. He drove east immediately. When he arrived at Allen's headquarters in the middle of the afternoon, with the smoke of burning panzers still rising from the valley floor, he did not celebrate. He read the after-action summary. He looked at the casualty list. According to accounts by his aide, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Codman, Patton was quiet for a long moment before saying anything at all. The victory did not develop into the breakthrough Patton wanted. General Sir Harold Alexander, the British officer commanding the 18th Army Group and Patton's immediate superior in the field, had already decided for reasons that were as much political as operational that the final destruction of Axis forces in Tunisia would be delivered by Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery and the 8th Army from the south. Patton was ordered to hold, not to exploit, not to drive on Gabes, to hold. Patton wrote in his personal diary that night, in language that Martin Blumenson would later publish in the Patton Papers, that the British had betrayed him. He obeyed the order anyway. 6 weeks later, on May 12th, 1943, in the final collapse of Axis forces on Cape Bon, Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim surrendered to British forces. Under interrogation in the weeks that followed, and in German command records captured after the surrender, a reassessment emerged that had already begun to shape German staff work during the final month of the campaign. The Americans who had held the ridges at Guettar were not the Americans who had broken at Kasserine. Rommel himself never returned to Africa. His health, briefly restored, deteriorated again after the Allied invasion of France. On July 20th, 1944, when a plot by German officers to kill Hitler failed, Rommel was implicated by association. On October 14th, 1944, given the choice between a public trial that would harm his family or a private suicide that would be reported as an honorable death, Rommel took the cyanide capsule provided by 2 SS officers in a staff car outside his home in Herrlingen. George Patton would command the 3rd United States Army across France and into Germany. He would relieve the encircled defenders of Bastogne in the winter of 1944. He would cross the Rhine at Oppenheim in March 1945. On December 9th, 1945, in occupied Germany, his staff car was struck by a 2.5-ton truck at low speed on a road outside Mannheim. He died of his injuries 12 days later. December 21st, 1945. Patton and Rommel never met. Not in Africa. Not anywhere. The duel that history remembers was a duel fought through subordinates, through doctrine, through captured documents, and post-war interrogation transcripts. Duel fought by 2 men who spent months studying each other from opposite sides of a desert they never crossed together. At the North Africa American Cemetery in Carthage, Tunisia, on the north coast of the country, the campaign had been fought over. More than 2,800 American soldiers are buried. Among them are men of the 1st Infantry Division, the 1st Ranger Battalion, and the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion who died in the last week of March 1943 in a valley that most Americans today have never heard of. defending a position that made no difference to the ultimate outcome of the war, and every difference to what the American army would become. Father served, if your grandfather served, if any of your family walked that ground and came home changed, this is the story they lived. The story of the day the American army stopped being what Rommel thought it was and became what Patton had promised Eisenhower it could be. The place, in the words of the Tunisian villagers who still live in the shadow of those ridges where the Americans did not leave.